Well, thank you, Hillary. Thank you, Dean Wilson, for the generous introduction. Very grateful to BFI, OLAB, and GSVP for sponsoring this event. And I'm excited today to share some of my own work on the topic of work requirements and their effects on safety net access and employment with you all today. I'm going to start by kind of talking about more broad backgrounds and introduction to work requirements for those who may be less familiar with it, what they look like in the context of SNAP, and then I'll talk about some of my own research on this topic. So policymakers have long debated whether means-tested programs should require certain people to work in order to receive benefits. And there's been a history of having work requirements in safety net programs at least as far back as the 17th century, the so-called Poor Laws in England, which lasted for a couple of hundred years. More recently, and the policy that I'll be talking about today was the, quote, welfare reform under Bill Clinton in 1996. Now, the official name for that is the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. So I put that up here so it's very clear to you kind of the way that it centers work in the safety net. I want to lay out what the proponents and the opponents of this policy say before going into some of the research. So proponents are concerned that providing people with benefits is going to discourage work. And so they see work requirements as a way to encourage people to be greater attached to the labor market. And the hope is that by encouraging that labor market attachment, people will earn enough so that over time they become self-sufficient and don't need to rely on public benefits to get by. A second argument that is sometimes made for work requirements relates to something that Hillary mentioned, which is about administrative burdens. Some people actually view burdens, and you can think of work requirements as kind of like an ordeal, as more of a feature than a bug, in the sense that by having people kind of go through and try to overcome various hurdles to get benefits, that the most needy people, the ones who stand to benefit the most, are going to be more likely to try to do so. And so it will somehow target benefits to people who stand to benefit from them the most. Now, by contrast, opponents see work requirements as fundamentally weakening the safety net. And in particular, it ends up screening out those people who are most vulnerable and in times when they really need help the most. So they argue that if work requirements really don't lead to any increases in employment because the reason that people may be unemployed is not about these economic incentives of the program, but about other barriers they face, then this is really just kind of undermining the safety net. So to give you a sense of how relevant this is today, rewind 6 months, think about the debt ceiling debates that we had, and work requirements ended up being central to those discussions, and ultimately were kind of the last sticking point, right? So here's a smattering of headlines that point to this, fairly small set of the overall safety net. As Hillary mentioned, it's only about 12% of people on SNAP kind of fall into this group. But this almost led to the default in the US. So what are exactly the SNAP's work requirements? Well, they apply to a group of largely childless adults who don't have disabilities. And this group is often called by this acronym, able-bodied adults without dependents, or ABODs. Now, if you fall into this category, you are also maybe not caring for an elderly dependent, and you're not working, training, or volunteering for 80 hours a month, then you're only eligible for 3 months of benefits within a 36-month period. So historically, this has been in effect when we haven't been in recessions. This policy has now come back so that in many states, people have to satisfy work requirements again. And as part of the debt ceiling negotiations, the age at which people have to satisfy work requirements was increased to 54. That was something the Republicans wanted. But then there were exemptions granted. And so as part of this compromise, some vulnerable groups, like those who are unhoused, people who are veterans, and young adults in foster care are now exempt. We also see work requirements in other safety net programs. So the temporary assistance to needy families, which is another big part of the 96 policy change, TANF. And then somewhat surprisingly, even in Medicaid, which is about health insurance. So there was a 9-month period under the Trump administration, in which Arkansas implemented work requirements. And currently, they're actually in place in Georgia right now. So what do we know about the effects of this policy? Surprisingly, even though they've been around for a while, we don't know that much empirically. And that's partly been because it's hard to get access to really good data in which you can track people's use of the safety net and employment histories over time, right? Surveys often have a lot of measurement error, and they might only capture people at a specific point in time rather than kind of following them for a period of years and decades. And also you need some kind of way to essentially randomize who's subject to work requirements and who isn't. Now, there were some experiments done in the 80s and 90s as part of the welfare to work experiments that had a work requirement component, but that was often bundled with other things like earning supplements. So it was difficult to disentangle what's the effect of work requirements from other types of policies. So the Arkansas Medicaid experiment I just mentioned found that in this short period of time before a federal judge stopped it because of the coverage losses, that there were large numbers of people becoming uninsured. There was no change in employment, and most people had very low awareness about the policy. In more recent years, what I'm going to now switch to is some of the work that has looked at the SNAP work requirements for this group of able-bodied adults without dependents. And so this is a paper that was published in April. It's co-authored with Colin Gray, Ellie Prager, Kelsey Bukelis, and Mary Zaki. And we're grateful to acknowledge funding from the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities for this work. And what we sought out to do was to try to understand what are the effects of work requirements on these key outcomes that people try to study, which is often participation in SNAP, employment, and earnings. And the way we did this was to try to get really detailed data that was collected by the Department of Social Services in Virginia and link that at the individual level to people's earnings records that were collected by the Virginia Employment Commission. So other studies had not been able to kind of bring those two pieces together, and that's kind of one of the main innovations of our study. Now, during the period that we look at, work requirements were suspended as part of the Great Recession. And so that's helpful for us because then we have this period when folks don't have to meet the work requirements, even if they would, otherwise qualify. And then we see what happens when work requirements are turned back on. And the way that we're going to try to proxy for this, the absence of randomization, is to compare people who are just below age 50, which is the age at which you age out of work requirements, to those who are just above and who don't have any disabilities or dependents. And so the only difference between this group is that some people are slightly older than 50 and some people are slightly younger. So I'm going to show you the results of this graphically, and let me walk you through this because there are going to be a few of these similar types of pictures. So on the x-axis here is the age at which work requirements resumed in Virginia. So they came back in October of 2013. And what we then do is we look 18 months later in March of 2015, and we count how many people are on SNAP who meet the criteria of not having any disabilities or dependents. And so each dot here is plotting those number of people within a monthly age bin. And so what I've shown here to the right of 50 is we run a regression for these data points, and we say we expect about 205 SNAP recipients right at age 50 in the absence of work requirements. We can then do the same thing on the left-hand side. You'll notice there's a very big jump here. This is the effect of work requirements. These people who are younger than 50 have to comply with work requirements in order to stay on SNAP and receive benefits for more than a few months. Now you'll see that there's kind of this increase with these hollow circles here, and that's because the way that Virginia ended up rolling out this program was they would assess your compliance with the work requirements when you came in at recertification, which happened in a staggered fashion over time. And so some people had to recertify right after the work requirements came back. Some people didn't have to recertify until another year. And then if they weren't working at that time, they'd come back in another 6 months. And if they still weren't working, then they would have to be removed from SNAP. And so it took 18 months for kind of the full force of this policy to come into effect. And what we see here is there's about 110 missing people, right at age 50, as a result of this policy. That ends up corresponding to about 53% lower participation in SNAP. So kind of the take-home message is that work requirements end up reducing SNAP participation by over half. Now, there's a couple of different sources for these declines. One could be that there were people who were already on SNAP when the work requirements came back, and they then were more likely to exit once they had to meet the requirements. Another is that people who joined SNAP after October of 2013 also ended up exiting at a higher rate. And the third is that the work requirements may have actually discouraged some people from even signing up in the first place. We find evidence for all three of those channels, but the number one is the reduced retention of people who are already on SNAP in September of 2013. So I'm going to focus on that group for the rest of the talk. So now what we do is we look and see, among people who are on SNAP in September of 2013, how many of those people are still on SNAP 18 months later? So among 50-year-olds who aren't subject to the work requirements, there's about 63% of people who would still be on SNAP. People leave SNAP for other reasons. So there's kind of some natural attrition. This is our case of, what we should expect in the absence of work requirements. What happens to the younger group? We see that there's a very large reduction in SNAP participation. There's a 23 percentage point decline, which is about 37% of this 63% mean. So again, quite large in magnitude. Now you might say, well, maybe there's other things that are happening at age 50, right? Like you just drew a line here at age 50. Maybe other things are going on. Well, what we can do is we can rewind 2 years and look and see, well, what happened when work requirements were not in effect during the Great Recession? Follow people who were enrolled in SNAP in 2013, in 2011 in September, fast forward 18 months and see how many of them are still enrolled. Now there's no change in enrollment. So this is kind of pretty convincing evidence that what we're seeing is the effect of the work requirements and not of something else. Who's screened out by this policy? We can do subsample analysis, and what we find is it's ultimately those folks who are unhoused who exit SNAP at disproportionately high rates. So this is kind of quite strong evidence against that argument that I put out there that some people have put forward that maybe these burdens are a good thing. We want to kind of protect people who are most vulnerable. This is pretty strong evidence that they're harmed. We find no evidence that employment increases. So when we look and see who's working with and without work requirements, it's about 27%, 28% regardless. We see the same pattern if we do that same exercise when work requirements were not in effect. So maybe you think, okay, maybe it doesn't change how much, whether people are working, but maybe people work more as a result of the policy. So we can look at people's earnings. We do that, and we again find there's no change in average earnings as a result of the policy. And so overall, what we're finding is that work requirements largely serve to reduce the SNAP rolls dramatically. They disproportionately harm those folks who are unhoused, and they have no positive effect on employment or earnings. So our study has a number of limitations, right? Like all do, but in particular, we looked just at Virginia. This was because of the type of methods we used. We're really only saying something about people at age 50. And, we're also only able to use administrative data. So we can't look at some of the important things like food insecurity or health that you might want to look at as well. But hopefully, by, using kind of more studies like this and others to kind of inform debates that, maybe we can kind of take a more informed stance as these policies are continued to kind of be addressed in the future. My sense is that we've not heard the last of this work requirement debate. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A.